Well, welcome back to Lesson 3 in our course on dodging and burning here at Retouching Academy. And this lesson, we're going to be focused entirely on global dodge and burn, or contouring, depending on what you want to call it. And we're going to look at a couple of different examples here. I'm going to start off just by showing you how the contouring affected this particular image. So this is a completed one, and then we're going to actually look at contouring two different images, sort of start to finish. So in this particular image here, I think it serves as a good example for a couple of interesting things. Now, the first thing is that when we're doing the contouring globally, much like with the local or corrective dodge and burn, we want to use some sort of a helper layer. And now the difference between using the helper layer there and here is that, generally speaking, I'll use the helper layer here for sort of half of the work, and then I'll usually just turn it off and just kind of make sure everything's looking okay in the color version that I have as well. Because, with contouring, it does tend to look a little bit different in black and white than it does in color. So you always want to just sort of toggle back and forth and make sure that everything is looking good in both versions. So when it comes to the helpers here, once again, we've used a color fill, and the reason the color fill becomes particularly important in an image like this is because we have gels introduced into this image. So this one actually isn't incredibly drastic. I mean, I've got some images where we have really strong gelled light, and at that point, using a black and white adjustment layer causes a number of problems because, the skin tones are mixed in, with blues and reds and, whatever colors of gels you have, along with the yellow and red that's originally in the skin. So by kind of using those sliders within a black and white adjustment layer, it will give you a very different interpretation of the image than just taking out all of the color information. So essentially with this one, we have something like this when we take out the color information, and then with a black and white layer, it'll look slightly different in this case. Again, there's not a dramatic difference in this particular image, but it's still enough to kind of, make it important. Like you can see, this is what we're sort of getting. And when we start playing with some of these sliders, we really get sort of a dramatic difference in the appearance of things. So for that reason, we want to just kind of cancel out some of the noise that we are creating by having these additional sliders and simply just take out the color information. So this is kind of what we're getting instead. And I've got this curves adjustment to kind of help us visualize things. Now, again, let's just kind of take off that curves adjustment. This is what we had with black and white adjustment layer, and this is what we have with our sort of pure desaturating layer. Sorry, right there. Let's try that one more time. So that is original, that's black and white, and that is our helper layer using our solid color fill layer on color blend mode. So again, it's just, really taking out a lot of the stuff that is distracting to us and focusing us on just the luminosities and the contours of the face. And so we're going to use that here. And for example, where we used this curves layer previously to visualize sort of the imperfections in the skin when we were doing the corrective work, we don't necessarily need that here. So once you're contouring, you can actually take that out because, again, that's sort of distorting your view of what the image actually looks like, because in reality, the image just isn't that dark. I mean, this is sort of artificially darkening down our image, so the contour looks more intense than it actually will in our final. So again, take that off and try and keep the representation to a purely sort of desaturated version of your color image. So that's our helper layer, essentially. And when it comes to the contouring itself, I've got this organized sort of in the same way we've been looking at in previous classes here, or previous lessons, I should say. And so the contouring is constrained to this group here. We've got a burn and dodge layer, and then we've got our, I call this fixture, but this is essentially analogous to the corrective layer that we had in our example in the last lesson. And so you can see what's going on here. If I take off, let's just take off dodge and burn entirely. This is sort of what we're getting originally, and then with dodge and burn on, you can just sort of see how polished it becomes. Certainly there's, little things that can still be dealt with here. There's a couple of patchy areas down on the chest and whatnot, but, we're not going to dwell on that at this point, just to kind of give you an example of how all of this comes together. So let's just look at them individually here. Let's take off our contouring, take off our corrective layers here. So this is the corrective portion of it. Again, just smoothing things out. For this, we can turn on our helper, and you can really kind of see, the areas that we've targeted. And you can see we've kind of worked on the eyes, some of the shadowing within the eyes, taking that out. So that is all of our fixes. And then let's take this off and look at the contouring. So the contouring, as you can see, it's really just kind of giving depth and dimension to the image, but also accenting some of the features of the face. So, if you kind of look around the cheekbone area, around the nose, around the lips, and eyebrows, sort of this area here where we have the natural shadow. Within here, just kind of keep an eye on those areas as I sort of toggle this on and off. So basically, it's a combination of giving the image more depth and also emphasizing facial features. And then if we jump back to color, this is our before and this is our after. So as you can see, it's not like a dramatic difference. We're not going for something that is, hugely removed from the original image. We want something that, that is close, but at the same time, just has a little bit more pop to it. Now, when it comes to contouring, that's one of those things that, some retouchers don't do at all. In fact, they just they do the corrective work, they do the color grading, and that's really it. Sometimes they do it very sparingly, and then, there's some people like me who I pretty much always contour an image, at least to, some extent, because I just find that it gives it that depth and dimension that I really like in my final image. So it's, it's entirely up to you. It's not a step that is necessarily required, but, it can make the image look really nice. Now, that being said, when it comes to contouring, there are some dangers and pitfalls, of course, as with most things in retouching. And one of the problems is that people do tend to go overboard with contouring, and you don't really want to do that. Like, for example, when we get into this area here, we don't want to start to over contour something like a cheekbone, for example. Whereas here we just kind of brought that so that we have a little bit more shadowing there, and ultimately what that does is it makes the cheekbone look more pronounced and sort of sharper, which in the context of beauty, fashion photography, that is obviously something you want, and generally that is something you look for in a model where they have strongly defined jawlines, cheekbones. So we're sort of just trying to amp that up, bring it out a little bit more. By the same token, though, you don't want to kind of take it to the point where it's unrealistic. And a lot of people do that, and they do it simply by going beyond what is really there in the original image and starting to work on the face in different areas. So one common problem I see is that people will actually take this line all the way down, sort of, and you don't really want that. You really want to just accent this main area and then, kind of taper off into here. But once you kind of start going beyond that, it starts to look rather fake. So really focus on this area in here, and then, just taper at the end here so that it sort of naturally flows out. And of course, everything is dependent on light as well. Like in this case here, we would just emphasize this little area here to bring that out. And so, again, it's one of those things that you have to practice and kind of develop a sense for, because there's really two flavors of this, and we're going to look at it when we actually look at our concrete example, where version number one is essentially to take what is there and just kind of amp it up. So we want to just kind of take those key areas and emphasize them even more. The other variation is actually changing the structure of the face slightly by using this contouring, which essentially is all it's changing is the interplay of light and shadow. And once you start to interpret that light and shadow and how it forms the features of the face, at that point, I would say, start getting into that area. It's sort of a dangerous thing to start off with at the beginning, because once I start to, sort of dodge certain areas, burn certain areas in an effort to change the look of the face, that's obviously, of course, when you're deviating from the original image. And if you don't do it sort of sparingly and carefully, you can start to change the anatomy in a very bad way. So where I would always recommend that you start is just kind of follow the light and shadow and contours that are already there and just amplify them. And that's where we're going to start. And at the same time, we're going to look at a slight example here within the context of this image here, where we're going to just kind of maybe shape the forehead a little bit differently, and we'll see how that works out for us. And when it comes to that kind of stuff, again, it's good to just sort of play around, and if it doesn't look good, we toggle on and off, we roll back, and we try again, or we just sort of abandon that idea. So we're going to look at a strategy for doing that as well. So that is just sort of an introductory example to what we're working towards. And so let's go ahead and we're going to start kind of continuing work, I guess, on the image that we started in the previous lesson. So we did our corrective work on this one, toggling this on and off. That's sort of where we are right now. And next step, of course, is to start actually contouring it. So as we talked about, we're going to go ahead and turn off our curves adjustment here. So we're just going to get it back to kind of the original luminosity. And we're going to go into our contouring layers. So with the contouring layers, with the corrective stuff, obviously here we don't have any corrections for color shifts, because this is going to be a black and white image in the end. But, and again, we're going to talk about that in our next lesson. But with this one here, as opposed to using normal blend mode, which we use here so we can apply our color corrections, with the contouring, generally I tend to use luminosity blend mode. And simple reason for that is that when I start to burn in, particularly for burning purposes, when I start to burn in these shadow areas, I don't want to actually increase the saturation in them because, generally for fashion photography, you lean towards a more desaturated image as opposed to a saturated one. So when it comes to burning, again, when I'm sort of darkening those areas down, I don't want to increase the saturation. So by setting it to luminosity, it will just keep the same level of saturation and then just kind of darken down the luminosity in the areas we have masked in. Other than that, the actual implementation is going to be the same. Again, you could use a 50% gray layer for this. Have two gray layers, have one for burn, one for dodge, like we showed in the previous one, and then paint white or black, depending on which one you're using. Again, no harm in that. The reason, once again, that I don't really like to use it is because then I lose this ability to either clip a hue saturation adjustment to it or change the blend mode to luminosity, because, of course, with the 50% gray layer solution, we have to use either overlay or soft light or one of those kinds of blend modes. So again, I tend to use just curves, and it works for me. But certainly feel free to experiment with the 50% gray layer option. If it works better for you, by all means use that. So beyond that, there's really nothing crazy going on here. We've kind of looked at this. This is sort of what my curve looks like. Dodge and burn. Once again, these are sort of arbitrary points. You don't have to make them exactly like this. They can be, the point can be higher, it can be lower. Ultimately, you kind of compensate for that by using the appropriate flow rate within your brush settings. So we're using around like 1 to 3% for corrective work. Here we're going to use anywhere from 2 to 4%, depending on, once again, what your settings are, what your curve looks like. And in terms of starting point, it really doesn't matter. I tend to start with dodging because there is generally less of it. When you're doing corrective work, as you can see on our masks here, if we just kind of go to these, this is our corrective dodge and this is our corrective burn. So in this case, we definitely have a lot more work being done here on the dodge layer, whereas when it comes to contouring, you'll actually have the opposite. You're going to do a lot more burning than you're going to do dodging. So if we actually go back to this one, let's kind of look at this as an example. This is, again, our dodge mask, and this is our burn mask. So as you can see, for corrective stuff, definitely much more on the dodge side. And now when it comes to this one here, this is our dodge mask, and this is our burn mask. So, this one's actually fairly even. Generally speaking, though, you will have a lot more burning than dodging. So once again, it's just kind of image dependent. So let's go ahead and jump back. And like I said, I'm going to start with dodge because there's going to be less of it here. And the extent of it really depends on, how many highlights you already have in your image and how intense those highlights are. Like, for example, sometimes on the bridge of the nose, you'll actually have a very intense highlight. And in that case, certainly don't dodge it in anymore because it's already as bright as it's going to be. And you can always kind of verify that by hovering over this general area and seeing the distribution. So if you've got your info panel open here, look at the RGB values. And if you kind of look at it, you can see we've got 243 on the red, and then, like around 200 on green, and then 161 on blue. So that actually means that we still have a fair bit of room to brighten. If kind of the highest point seems to be 200, 220, 243. So we're approaching that point where it's almost white, but we still have a little bit of room to go there. So we can certainly pump that up a little bit more if we want to. Now, one thing that I think is important to emphasize is that, this really shouldn't, you should never really kind of paint in highlights where highlights don't exist. And the reason for that is, I've been seeing this a lot lately in a lot of images that, are very flat, and then we sort of paint in these highlights. And the problem with that is that the texture in a highlight area is very different than the texture in either, sort of a midtone or shadow area. So let's just kind of zoom in on this particular image here and look at it in a bit of detail. So what you can see is that the texture here has a lot of sharpness and sort of spectrality to it. If we look at something like this, where it's sort of a mid-tone, let's imagine we grab, something like 10% flow rate, and we start painting this in. You can see that when I make this really bright using the dodge layer, what am I really doing? Well, one thing I'm doing, unfortunately, is actually taking some of the texture out because it's kind of just like flattening everything down. And the other thing you'll notice is that this texture here, even though we're sort of, making it super bright, it's not really approaching this sort of texture. And the reason for that, I mean, certainly the nose will have slightly different texture than an area of, of the cheek. But beyond that, you're just not going to replicate the texture because there's sort of an interplay of the light and the texture within the skin and the way it's picked up. So the best way to really achieve a good, strong highlight there is through makeup and proper lighting. So don't think that you can kind of skip those things and, contouring will fix everything. It certainly will not. So just make sure that, the better the starting point, the more natural the result will be. So with that digression out of the way, let's just go ahead and fill that back in. So I've just been using this dodge layer here. I'm just going to hit Command Delete to fill that back in black so we don't have anything there. And let's go ahead and start contouring. Now, because contouring, also known as global dodging and burning, is global in nature, we're not really going to be doing any sort of, super fine areas, so you don't ever really need to be zoomed in, like 100% to be doing contouring. In fact, I don't ever recommend that you zoom in 100% because you don't get a full view of what the image looks like. Much like we kind of discussed with our corrective work previously. So just kind of stay, at a zoom level where you kind of can target the areas that you want and then, work as far away as possible whenever possible. So let's go ahead and start with our dodging. And generally, I'm just kind of looking at the highlights that we have here. So we have a little bit above the eye, and sometimes I like to emphasize this little area above the eye. Sometimes I like to kind of go in here. You know what? We are still on 10%, which we don't want. So I'm going to go back to 4% flow. So 100% opacity, 4% flow, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but definitely make sure you're using a Wacom tablet for all this kind of stuff. I'll make sure to make a note in previous lessons for this because we definitely want to kind of get the best that we can out of our work here. And if you're doing it with a mouse, you're just never going to get the proper brush strokes that you would using a tablet. So, certainly invest in a tablet. Even the small Wacom tablets are, I think, about $150, and it certainly works a lot better than using a touchpad or a mouse. So definitely something that's important to get before you do any sort of dodging and burning. So we're at 4%. I'm just going to work on some of those areas. So let's just go ahead and I'm going to start with the nose here. Now, one thing that is important when you're doing this kind of stuff is don't use, a brush size like this and then start working on those. Because again, I'll show you what happens. If we do this, and I've seen this a lot as well, people just use the wrong brush size. And then let's toggle this on and off. And what's happening? Well, we're actually making her nose a lot wider than it really is. I mean, sure, we're emphasizing a highlight there, but now it's just a bigger nose. And, that's essentially what light and shadow does, is it shapes the face. So pick the right brush size for the particular area you're working on. So once again, we're going to go back and fill this, and we're going to do this with the right brush size. So a little bit on the tip. Don't make the tip too bright. In this case, I think it's got enough pop, so I'm not going to really work on it too much. And, kind of vary down your brush size going from wider to smaller, just so that we can keep that, in the right shape. And just kind of toggling that on and off. If you find that you've gone too high, which maybe we have, let's just go ahead and just switch to black. You can just hit the X key. That will give you the opposite color. And we can just black that out. And then going back to white, we can just kind of go back into these areas a little bit, just make them pop a tiny bit more. And all of this really is optional, if you don't like emphasizing that area, don't emphasize the area. It's whatever, works well for you. Chin, I typically don't emphasize too much unless there is some sort of specific shaping that I want to do on it. And again, the reason for that is that if we create a strong highlight here, we're actually going to make the chin look like it protrudes out even more. And that's not something we want to do. Something like the nose, we want to make it look slender. So for that reason, we want to highlight here and a burn on the outsides. But the chin is not something that we necessarily want to make large. It's not, seen as like a super beautiful feature. So typically speaking, I don't ever really do anything with the chin unless there is some sort of shaping that needs to be done on it. So we're going to leave that area. Another area we're going to do is just, kind of a quick 1 or 2 swipes under the eye. I don't really do too much here either because then again, it starts to kind of change the shape of the face. And sometimes I will do a little bit right here underneath. Again, I just kind of follow the shape of the face. So depending on what kind of facial structure you're dealing with, whether it is a round face, a rectangular face, you'll kind of want to emphasize different areas. And for that, I just kind of follow what we have in our original image. And we can see that there is a little bit of highlight here, which essentially is just her jawline coming out and catching the light from above. So, it's okay to just emphasize that a little bit more. And once again, just kind of toggle on and off to see if you've gone too far with it. In this case, I think we'll be okay. Maybe a little bit too much on this side. So let me just kind of cover that up. And then we're going to just work on two other small areas here. Now, in this case, we do see a little bit of the clavicles. Usually, if they're more exposed, these are sort of areas that I emphasize as well. Once again, it's best if the makeup artist just applies highlight right there to begin with, because that certainly helps to pick it up. Again, difference in texture, you can see it right away when we zoom in here. Even though this is off the focal plane a little bit, you can see that sharper texture that we have here versus what is down below where there is no highlight. So definitely best to get that in camera. And so coming back to our face, one of the areas as well is sometimes just right above the cheekbone, because that will create that contrast between the cheekbone shadow and the cheekbone highlight. So a little bit there. And again, kind of keep in mind the direction of light. We can see that we have more shadow on this side of the face than on this side. So try and keep that distribution fairly balanced. If you're going to, something over here, I may do one pass, and then here we should do maybe two passes to kind of, offset that. So if we've got, some shadow here, we just want to make sure that we have more on this side than this side. I don't want to make this even with this, because then it starts to change the angle of light that's coming in. So just always be consciously aware of that. Now, one other area I like to do is the lips. And for that, you can use rotation. I mean, you can swipe side to side, but I find it's not very convenient to use your brush stroke side to side. Generally up and down or sort of at these angles is easier. So for that, just hit the R key and just kind of rotate your image around. And then we can just brush in here a couple strokes right where the highlight is. And right into the Cupid's bow here as well, we can just kind of make that pop a little bit more. Now, once again, it's just going to kind of make the lips seem more full and plump. And then hit the R key again. We can reset view to get back to the original. So I'm going to hit the B key again for brush. And let's just kind of see what we're doing here. As you can see, like super subtle. It's not really doing a ton yet, and that's why I said that generally the burning will be a lot more. It will have a lot more impact on the contouring side than it does on the corrective side. So that's probably all I'm going to do here. Forehead, I generally don't brighten, and particularly in this case, because once again, what we can see is that there is a highlight here because her forehead, is well, this is where it's catching the light. So it's sort of, this is the point closest to the camera, and then things are tapering off from there. And I don't necessarily want to emphasize this anymore, because it's just going to make the forehead look more round. So I'm not going to emphasize that highlight, which is just going to kind of work against us. We're actually going to try and scale that back a little bit as we go. So when we scale that back, I'm actually going to do it on a separate layer, because that's more, it's not really sort of emphasizing what's there. We're actually changing the facial structure. So I want to make sure that that is on a separate layer so I can easily roll it back if it turns out I made her look terrible. So we'll finish off with that. We're not going to worry about it at the moment. So we're going to go ahead and switch to burn for now. And just go ahead and start burning the areas, because that's going to be a lot more interesting here. Now, actually, let me just go to dodge. And another area that I see that I kind of wouldn't mind emphasizing is a little bit here and here. So oftentimes on the shoulders, I will just emphasize the highlights. Kind of this bone going through here and onto the shoulder. And then sometimes in the neck area, I mean, we can just add a little bit of extra highlight and shape in there. And then obviously, if we have like a kicker light coming in here from the back, lighting something, I might, emphasize further highlight or along the jawline where that kicker light is sort of carving out the face. But in this case, we don't have that. So let's go to burn and grab our brush. So we can just go ahead and here again, if you want, you can just rotate this around. We're just going to emphasize this shadow in here. And then we're going to burn on the inside of the lips. That again is just going to create, deeper shadow here, brighter highlight here. And I can actually emphasize the highlight inside this area a little bit too if we want. So just kind of these two brighter areas, we're going to pump that up. And then just going inside the mouth here just to create a little bit more of a three-dimensional effect. And then underneath the nose, oftentimes I like to just sort of emphasize that. Sometimes you have a very sharp shadow here, depending on what kind of light source you're using. This was a relatively soft light because it was a large modifier. But if we had something like an open reflector or a beauty dish, you would see a pretty defined shadow underneath the nose, and that is something that I would definitely burn in quite dramatically. And then we're going to do a little bit on the outside of the nose here, not too much. And again, be conscious of where the light is coming from. If the light is coming from this side, then this side should certainly be darker. And generally, if the light is coming in from this side, I don't actually do any sort of burning on the other side because it really makes no sense. I just kind of keep it as is. And in fact, I'm kind of feeling as though this side maybe is still too dark, so I've actually over-contoured it. I'm just going to roll it back a bit. And so once again, just going back to my white brush, and we're going to just do our brows. This is, kind of subjective. You can darken them or not. It depends on if you prefer a light brow or a dark brow. And once again, the extent of this is entirely up to you. This is kind of the artistic part of dodging and burning, whereas, corrective is really just fairly methodical. You go through and look at areas that don't look right, you lighten them, you darken them. With this, it's a lot more subjective, so this is sort of where your artistic sensibility comes in and your vision for the image. But again, just don't ever go to the point where it looks, cartoony and ridiculous, particularly if it's commercial work, because it just doesn't fly. If it's like a fine art piece, then, perhaps you can certainly do that. But for commercial sort of fashion work, make sure you keep things rooted in reality. So, let's just go ahead and grab our brush again here. And sometimes I do these areas under the eye, sometimes I don't. One area I do often do is just this area right in here, just to kind of create a little bit more shape in there. I'm just going to roll it back one to see how we're doing there. Okay, so that's what we got. And let's just zoom out a bit. I don't think we need to be zoomed in this far anymore, because really I only zoomed in to do the nose and the lips. So let's just see how that's looking. And yeah, I think the brows are maybe a little too dark. So once again, I'll go back in, take a little bit of that out. And this is another reason why I like to use masks, because it's very easy to just, like using the X key, I can toggle between white and black, and then, mask in or take something away. With a 50% gray layer, if you want to take something away, you have to paint back in 50% gray, which is just a harder color to select than black and white, because if you hit the D key, it will reset to white and black as your foreground and background, and then X toggles between them. So that's, just one other reason why I like to use the curves instead of the 50% gray layer. So let's just see how we're doing here. I think overall, for now, things are okay. I think maybe this area here in the lips is now a little too pronounced. So once again, we go back to dodge, grab black, and just kind of get rid of that down in here, because I don't like it. There we go. And again, very important to just toggle on and off, because that ultimately will tell you whether you're on the right track. And I'm going to scale a little bit back on the nose on this side, and just a bit on that side. Once again, because the light is so soft, I don't want to kind of overdo this. So that's probably pretty good there. And then let's go ahead and continue our burning here. So we're on the burn layer, painting in white. And I'm just going to grab sort of this side of the forehead and just do a little bit there. And we can even cover this highlight a little bit, or we can dodge. So I'm going to leave that for now. We're going to do that once again in a separate layer. And then I'm going to grab this area in the chin here, just where the actual shadow already is, and just emphasize it. And then a little bit on this side too. And then we're going to look at this contour here. So basically I'm going to grab from here, and I'm just going to do something like that, and then enlarge the brush and grab a little bit more. So just kind of keep to where the original stuff already is. And then again, similarly on this side, we're going to just go ahead and take it up the cheekbone and then across, something like that. And then what you can do too is, if you want to make the whole face narrower, just grab a large brush and create, sort of one swipe there and one swipe here. And that's just going to make the whole face look narrower. Just sort of about the size where it reaches into the cheekbone. But again, don't go overboard on that particular one there. So here I'm just going to kind of work around some of these areas where there's, I don't find that the contour's flowing together. I'm just going to kind of tie it together. In here, I just find like this contour is a little too sharp, so I'm just going to smooth it in. Same with this area here. And then We're going to go ahead and emphasize that, and just a little bit more here, I think. And then right above the Cupid's bow, I'm just going to darken the already existing shadow, and maybe a little bit on this side here. And I think we are pretty close. Let's see here. So that's sort of where we are. To be honest, to me, this is probably a little too much, but at least it's consistently too much, so we might just scale back our opacity a little bit here. And then I'm just going to look at the body here. Let's just go ahead and add a little bit of shadow underneath the clavicles here. We can add a little bit more shadow around the neck, just slenderize the neck a bit more. Underneath the chin, we can sort of boost that shadow. And then inside, arms, we can just kind of darken the shadow that's already there, sort of between the body here. Now, one thing I often do is I do extract the subject. If I've got something other than like a white background and I really want to contour these edges, I'll just kind of cut the subject out using quick select and like a refine edge, just so that I'm not painting on the background and you get this sort of darker halo around your subject. So definitely, something, if you are doing it quite dramatically there, just make sure you do an extraction, or at least, sort of a mask in that area so you're not painting. It just looks amateurish if you see that halo there. If you're painting against a white background, though, you won't really notice it. So in this case, we shouldn't really notice anything, even if we do start painting here. All right, so that's pretty good, I think. Let's just go ahead and toggle that on and off. And again, I think it's a little too intense, so I'm just going to scale this back to maybe 70% or so. All right, I think that's pretty good. Yeah, I think that'll do. Okay, and then let's go ahead and just hit Command-J and duplicate this. And we're going to do this sort of work on the top area here. So I'm just going to select both of them, Command-Delete to fill in black, Command-Delete to fill in black again, and we'll just call this contour shape, let's say. We can call it whatever you want, but as long as we have a separate layer for it, because again, if I screw this up, I don't want to be screwing it up on top of the contouring that I already like. So in this case, I'm going to grab my dodge, and let's just do this at a lower flow rate of about 2%. And so I'm going to just paint a little bit around this area here. And what I'm trying to do is just flatten out the forehead a tiny bit. Because again, we had highlight here in the center, and then quick shadow, and that's just creating a round surface. If we flatten this out, it creates a flatter surface, of course. So we're going to do that, and then we can just burn in sort of this top area around here. And then I'm just going to dodge a little bit more over here, I think. And if we want to, we can also burn that highlight on the forehead to reduce it a little bit as well. So toggling that on and off, again, super subtle effect, but it just flattens out the forehead a tiny bit. And that's really all we're after here. So let me just actually burn this area in a little bit more. All right. So something like that. And, I do that whenever I think that there's a chance that I'm going to make things look worse. I just create a separate layer for that and, try it. If it doesn't work, we delete it, try again, or, sort of change strategies. So just, if there's something that works, that's good, keep that layer separate, and then just do what we just did here. So there we go. That is the contouring, more or less, for this image here. Let's just grab both of these here. I'm just going to group them. And we'll just call this our complete contour. All right, and toggling on and off. There we are. So as you can see, again, just giving a little bit more definition, a little bit more shape to the face, and that's really what we're after. Now, one thing I often do is also just dodge in some of the highlights in the hair. Again, we can just do that pretty quickly here. May as well do it now, because it's kind of like contouring, but it isn't. We can just call this hair. And once again, let's just fill this in. And for this, I grab a fairly liberal flow rate, like 10% or so. So just shift 1, that'll give us 10%. And we just go in here and just paint in some of these highlights. I think that's probably all I want to do for highlighting. Maybe a little bit in here. And then again, we can grab our burn layer and just kind of burn in the hair up here, because again, this is catching the light, so it's, you know, a lot lighter than the rest of the hair down here. So I may as well just kind of darken that up. And if you want to create a little bit more contrast in between these areas, you can just burn in the gaps here. Something like that. All right. So let's just check that again. This is sort of what we've done as far as contouring goes. So the next thing we're going to look at is applying these same techniques. We're going to look at it on this particular image. And so we've got our contouring layer here, and this is the finished image, and this is sort of the pre-contour image. So we've got, you know, this is the original, this is just with fixer, color grading, all that kind of stuff, and then this is with the final contouring applied. So we're going to do this contouring now on this particular color image here. So first thing we're going to do is just reintroduce our solid color layer here. So let's go ahead and get that in there, and we're just going to pick sort of a middle gray as our color. Nudge this up to the top and change our blend mode to color. And then we're going to be using these two layers that we have in our layer stack. Once again, this is sort of what the curves look like, and we've got them in luminosity blend mode. So once again, we're going to start with the dodging side of things. Let's turn off our fully contoured image and grab our brush at a 4% flow rate. Let's go ahead and start dodging. So I'm going to dodge fairly zoomed out at first. I'm just going to work on some of these areas on the body here. The arms, just kind of, you know, anywhere that there's a lightened area, just a small subtle swipe. Don't go too crazy on them, because again, they start to look kind of fake. Once again, a little bit on the clavicle. I've got a little highlight on the neck here. And I think that's pretty good on the body, maybe this little area here, and then we have a little highlight from this reflection coming off of I think I had a V-flat here, and it was just bouncing a little extra light there, so we just want to emphasize that. So I think that's pretty good on the body, and then we're going to just zoom in here. And I'm actually going to target this little highlight underneath the jawline. That's going to, again, further emphasize the jaw and kind of help it pop. So again, don't go too crazy there, but just a little bit of a highlight. And then a little bit of highlight here, and maybe a little bit in here. And then once again, we're going to hold the R key, rotate our image, and shrink down our brush. Again, I'm just using the square brackets here to, you know, enlarge and reduce the size of my brush. And then just a little bit of a highlight on the lip, a little bit on the top lip here, and into the Cupid's bow. I think that's probably going to be pretty good. And then we'll reset our view here. Maybe a little bit above the eye here and on the inside of the eye. Shrink down our brush a little bit. As far as the nose goes, I'm not really going to do too much. There's no real sharp highlight on the nose itself, and I'm not going to paint one in, so I'm pretty happy with the way the nose actually looks here. Maybe a little bit here, and a little bit here. And again, notice that the light is coming slightly from this angle, so there's going to be more light on this side of the face than on this side. So when we're doing our burning, we're going to just make sure to keep that in mind. I think the forehead looks good. I don't really want to kind of do anything there. Don't need to round it out or anything like that. So that, I think, is probably all we need to do with our dodging. Let's just have a quick look here. And yeah, I think dodging looks pretty good to me. So let's just toggle that on and off. Again, these are kind of subtle things. We'll dive into the burn layer now. And let's go ahead and grab this side. So maybe one or two swipes here, but then like a little bit more on this side, because that's where most of the shadow is. And then we'll get under the nose here and inside Cupid's bow, inside the lip, underneath the lips, right on the jawline itself. And again, we can see that this tapers away as we get to the end here, so don't take this too far. One thing you can always do is just kind of make the stroke and then grab a large brush, you know, switch it to black, and then just kind of fade it off as it goes towards the end here. And then again, we'll grab this over here, just further emphasize that line. Let's just go a little bit on the bridge of the nose here, a little bit in this area. And I'm going to darken down the brows a tiny bit again. Entirely optional. Maybe like a dark brow, a light brow. Maybe a little bit in the sort of temple area here. And in there. And of course, in the cheekbones itself. So again, we've cut this sort of point where I'd say this is as far as we want to go on this side of the face. So just bring that in a little bit there, a little bit up top. And really, again, I'm just following what's already there and just emphasizing it. All right. And then maybe we want to just narrow down the face slightly, so just a bigger swipe across both sides. Down the neck, let's just darken down the existing shadow a bit too. Emphasize that line. Underneath the clavicle. Just again, you know, as you can see, all I'm doing is just following the shadows that are already there. Here we'll just do swipe. Maybe in between the arms, that just kind of rounds things out a little bit. Around the outside of the body, again, if we had, you know, a darker background, we want to do an extraction here and just make sure that we're not painting on the background. But in this case, it's white, so it's not really going to cause too many issues for us. All right, maybe up here on the forehead. Let's just zoom out and see how we're doing here. So toggling on and off. All right, so that's probably where I'll end up on this. I mean, this is a portrait look after all. So, you know, with a beauty look, it's just really doing the same thing as I did here on the portrait look, but being a little bit more careful. As you can kind of see, this did not take a whole ton of time. So, you know, it's not a terribly tedious process. But that's basically kind of where I want to be. Now let's just toggle off our color fill just to make sure everything looks good in color as well, and I think it does. And it's important just to kind of verify everything because ultimately, you know, black and white just kind of changes our perception of the look of the image. It will look a little bit more scaled back when we actually look at it in color, but at the same time we want to make sure that it still looks natural. So overall, I'm pretty happy with that. That's basically what I want. As you can see, we've just really given a lot more of a three-dimensional feel to the image and, you know, emphasize some of her features, the cheekbones, the jawline, the lips in particular, and around the nose. Those are really kind of those target areas that you always want to aim to improve and enhance. So that's basically contouring in a nutshell. Now, just be advised that contouring is not necessarily constrained to just your subject. It can be also used for the environment that you're in. So if you've got an on-location shoot, if you've got, you know, trees or buildings, whatever it might be, if there's anything that's interesting, you know, from a visual standpoint, and you want to kind of emphasize the depth and dimension that's in there, you can certainly take the same approach to those different elements. You just, you know, kind of dodge in the highlight areas, burn in the shadow areas, and it will sort of selectively create this more three-dimensional look within your image. So I hope you found that lesson helpful, and as you can see, it's really not a terribly complicated thing. It's just really something that you have to practice and most importantly learn to emphasize some restraint on, because you know, it's very easy to get carried away and you know, just do too much of any one thing. So I would say, you know, always kind of aim on the side of under contoured to over contoured at the beginning, and you know, particularly be careful when you're venturing into this sort of thing where we start to change the shape of, you know, whether it's the forehead or the chin or the jaw, because it's very easy to get carried away and make the subject look completely different. So we want to always kind of, you know, stick to subtle changes that are enhancing, but you know, not deviate too far from the original. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at in the final lesson is how we're going to kind of account for any sort of shifts in color, and also look at some detail work, like how do we, you know, fix things in the lips, in the eyes, and what considerations do we have to make in terms of that. And that'll pretty much be our coverage of dodging and burning. But as you can see by this point already, just how powerful it is, especially if we go back to our image here and sort of start from the beginning, turning off our dodging and burning, and then turning it back on. Just what a difference it makes with essentially what is just a couple of adjustment layers and masks can get you very far. So I hope you enjoyed the lesson, and we're going to see you again in lesson 4, where we're going to put sort of finishing touches on our images, and we're going to be dealing with some considerations for color images and how we kind of go about that. So we'll see you again in the next lesson.